There are some decisions in the British monarchy that are not announced with big headlines. There is no grand ceremony and no long speech. Sometimes, a legal change simply passes through Parliament, and then the story quietly disappears. But sometimes, those quiet decisions become extremely important in the future. Something similar happened with Princess Anne. Today, there are reports suggesting that King Charles suddenly gave his sister a new and very powerful role within the monarchy. But the real story is much older. The foundation was laid in 2022, when Parliament changed the rules around Counsellors of State and added Princess Anne and Prince Edward to the group. But what exactly is a Counsellor of State? In simple terms, it is a constitutional arrangement that allows certain senior members of the royal family to carry out specific official duties on behalf of the monarch in certain circumstances. For example, if the monarch is abroad or temporarily unable to carry out some duties, the work of the state does not simply stop, and this is where Princess Anne's role becomes important. Before the 2022 changes, the system included people whose positions created practical difficulties for the monarchy. After King Charles became king, there was a growing question about who could realistically be trusted to carry out certain royal duties if the monarch became temporarily unavailable. The changes were designed to deal with that problem. Princess Anne and Prince Edward were added to the group of Counsellors of State, allowing them to serve in that constitutional role. The official royal family website confirms that the 2022 changes to the Regency Acts enabled the Princess Royal and the Duke of Edinburgh to serve as Counsellors of State. And Princess Anne's name is particularly interesting here, because she is not the heir to the throne. She is not going to become queen in the normal line of succession. But for decades, she has built a reputation as one of the most dependable and hard-working members of the royal family. That is why this change does not look like simple paperwork. It also shows the level of trust King Charles places in his sister. But there is one very important point to understand. Princess Anne was not made a regent in 2022, and there is no official constitutional position that simply makes her a new Princess Royal Regent. Her actual role is Counsellor of State, a constitutional position that allows certain royal functions to be carried out on behalf of the monarch in specific circumstances. That difference is extremely important, because headlines can make the change sound much bigger than the actual constitutional position. But that does not mean the role is unimportant. Princess Anne is now part of the group that can be called upon when necessary to help carry out certain constitutional functions of the crown. And that becomes even more significant when public attention is focused on King Charles and his ability to continue his official duties. So, a change that may have looked like technical parliamentary business in 2022 now appears much more important. Looking back, it raises an obvious question. Did King Charles prepare the monarchy for possible future situations when he made this change? If so, adding Princess Anne to this constitutional arrangement was not simply about paperwork. It was part of creating a safety net for the crown. But there is still a major question. What can Princess Anne actually do as a Counsellor of State? What powers does she have? And most importantly, can her role help keep the day-to-day constitutional machinery of the British monarchy working when the king is unavailable? This is where Princess Anne's story becomes much bigger than simply being the story of a hard-working royal. It becomes a story about the system behind the British crown, a system designed to make sure that government and royal business can continue even when the monarch is temporarily unavailable. And in the next part, we will look closely at that constitutional power and what Counsellors of State can and cannot do. Now, the big question is this. If Princess Anne is a Counsellor of State, how much real authority does she actually have? From the outside, it may look like just another royal title. But within the British constitutional system, the role is much more serious than that. Counsellors of State can carry out certain official duties on behalf of the monarch, especially when the king is abroad or temporarily unable to perform some of his duties. According to the official royal family website, these duties can include attending Privy Council meetings, signing routine documents, and receiving the credentials of new ambassadors. But there is one very important point. Princess Anne has not been made regent. A Counsellor of State and a Regent are two different roles. A Counsellor has a limited constitutional role. Certain powers can be delegated to them. A Regent, however, is part of a much wider constitutional arrangement. So, Princess Anne does not have the full constitutional authority of the king. But that does not mean her role is unimportant. If the circumstances require it, she can become an active part of the constitutional system that allows the crown to continue functioning when the monarch is temporarily unavailable. Imagine that King Charles is on an official visit abroad. The government cannot simply stop working. Cabinet continues its work. Parliament continues its work. Government documents continue to be prepared. Diplomatic communication continues. And during this time, there are certain official functions that require the involvement of the crown. This is where the Counsellors of State system becomes important. Under the current arrangement, 2 or more counsellors can be appointed by letters patent to act in the king's place when he cannot temporarily carry out his official duties because of illness or absence abroad. So Princess Anne is not going to sit alone in Buckingham Palace and run the country. The system is much more structured than that, but it does mean that, when required, she can become part of the machinery that keeps important royal functions moving. And that is exactly why the 2022 change matters. King Charles requested that Princess Anne and Prince Edward be added to the group of Counsellors of State. The purpose was to make sure that public business could continue when the king was unavailable. There was also a practical reason for the change. The traditional system included the monarch's spouse and the next 4 eligible people in the line of succession. But after King Charles became king, there were practical problems with relying on that group. Prince Harry was no longer a working royal in the United Kingdom. Prince Andrew was also no longer a working royal. And if the king and queen were both away from the country, the number of people who could realistically be called upon could become very limited. That is why adding Princess Anne and Prince Edward was more than simply increasing the number of names. It helped solve a practical constitutional problem. And there is another important detail about Princess Anne. This role was not completely new to her. She had already served as a Counsellor of State in the past. So when she was added again in 2022, the system was not bringing a completely inexperienced person into the constitutional process. It was bringing an experienced senior royal into the framework, and that becomes even more important when we look at Princess Anne's wider royal career. She has spent decades carrying out official duties. She continues to attend public engagements across the United Kingdom and overseas, and her public image has been very different from that of many other members of the royal family. Less drama, less controversy, and more duty. That is why, when the monarchy needs a senior royal who can quietly handle responsibilities, Anne's name naturally becomes important. But now the story becomes even more interesting, because as public attention around King Charles and his ability to continue his official duties grows, this constitutional safety net no longer looks like a purely theoretical arrangement. It raises a serious question. What happens if the king becomes unable to carry out his constitutional duties for a longer period? Would the Counsellors of State system be enough? Or would the monarchy eventually need a completely different constitutional mechanism, a regency? And if that ever happened, what would Princess Anne's role be? This is where Princess Anne and Prince William become connected, even though their roles are completely different. William is the future king. Anne is a senior royal with decades of experience and a formal constitutional role. She is not competing with William. Her role is not to replace him. Her role is to help maintain the stability of the crown when circumstances require it. And perhaps that is the most important part of this entire arrangement. The future of the monarchy belongs to William, but Princess Anne can play an important role in keeping the institution stable in the present. And now the next question becomes even more important. If King Charles ever became unable to carry out even his core constitutional duties, what would happen? Would Princess Anne remain a Counsellor of State? Or would the British monarchy have to consider the much bigger constitutional mechanism known as regency? That is where the story becomes even more sensitive. Because once the limits of a Counsellor of State are reached, the constitutional role of Prince William could suddenly become much more important. Now we come to the most sensitive question in this entire story. If King Charles is temporarily unable to carry out his official duties, The Counsellors of State system can help. But what happens if the situation is not temporary? This is where the difference between a Counsellor of State and a Regent becomes extremely important. Counsellors of State can carry out certain official functions on behalf of the monarch, but this arrangement does not permanently replace the king. The royal family's official website makes it clear that counsellors are used when the king is temporarily unable to carry out his official duties because of illness or absence abroad. If a situation ever developed where the monarch could no longer carry out his constitutional duties for a much longer period, the question would become much bigger. It would no longer simply be about who can sign certain documents. The question would become, who would constitutionally carry out the role of the crown? And this is where Prince William becomes important. William is the heir to the throne, but that does not mean Princess Anne could suddenly take his place. She cannot. Anne is not the heir. Her role is not to change the line of succession. Her role is to help maintain the stability and continuity of the monarchy. That difference is extremely important. On one side, there is William, the future king. On the other, there is Anne, a senior royal with decades of experience, and now a formal constitutional role as a Counsellor of State. Their roles are completely different, but they can support the same institution. And this is one of the reasons why the 2022 change has become so interesting. At the time, the purpose was clear: to make sure that public business could continue when the king was temporarily unavailable. The royal family confirms that Princess Anne and Prince Edward were added to the Counsellors of State system through changes to the Regency Acts in 2022. In simple terms, the message was the king may sometimes be unavailable, but the work of the crown cannot simply stop. And Princess Anne already had experience with this system. She had served as a Counsellor of State in the past. So bringing her back into this constitutional framework in 2022 was not about introducing someone with no experience. It was about giving an experienced senior royal a formal place within the system. But now another question appears. Has King Charles's health made this arrangement more important? We have to be careful here. It would be wrong to assume that any health issue automatically means the monarchy is moving toward a formal regency. As long as the king continues to perform his constitutional duties, there is no automatic need for a regency. And that is why calling Princess Anne a regent can be misleading. She has not replaced King Charles. She has not become the future queen. And she has not been given a constitutional office that gives her the same authority as the monarch. Her role is much more specific. She is part of the system that can help certain royal functions continue when the king is temporarily unavailable. That creates a kind of constitutional buffer. Imagine that the king is unavailable for a period of time. Government continues, parliament continues, and, where the law allows it, certain royal functions can continue through the Counsellors of State. The king remains king. The crown does not suddenly enter a completely different constitutional phase. This is why the system can provide stability without immediately triggering a major constitutional transition. Some observers describe this kind of situation using the phrase soft regency, but that should not be confused with a formal regency. A soft or informal arrangement is not the same thing as officially appointing a regent. And if a formal regency were ever required, Prince William would become extremely important because he is the heir to the throne. But for now, the most important point is that Anne and William are not competitors. They have different responsibilities. William is preparing for the future. Anne helps strengthen the institution in the present. And perhaps this is one of the most important parts of King Charles's approach. The monarchy cannot depend entirely on one person. It needs a wider structure of senior royals who can support the crown when circumstances require it. That structure includes Queen Camilla, Prince William, Prince Edward, and Princess Anne. But Anne has one particular advantage. She is not part of a competition for the throne. Her role is not about gaining the crown. Her role is about helping the crown continue to function. And this may be one of the reasons why her position is so valuable. But there is another side to the story. Princess Anne's importance does not come only from a law passed by Parliament. It also comes from decades of royal service. She has built a reputation for consistently carrying out official duties. She is known for working rather than seeking attention. And that consistency may be one of her greatest strengths, because constitutional authority can be created by law, but public trust cannot be created by law. It has to be earned, and Princess Anne has spent decades earning it. So, if the British monarchy ever faces a difficult constitutional situation in the future, Princess Anne's role could become extremely important. But it is important to understand what that role actually is. She is not replacing the king. She is not taking the throne, and she is not replacing Prince William. She is part of a constitutional system designed to help the crown continue functioning when the monarch is temporarily unavailable. And that brings us to the final question. Why has Princess Anne become such a trusted and important figure inside the royal family? And how could her role influence the future of the British monarchy? Because her real strength may not come from the title or the law. It may come from something much harder to create: decades of experience, consistency, and service. So, why has Princess Anne become such an important figure within the British monarchy? The answer is not only found in the law passed in 2022. The real answer is in her decades of royal service. One of the most distinctive things about Princess Anne is that she has never tried to take the most glamorous position within the monarchy. She is not the heir to the throne. She is not going to become queen in the normal line of succession. And yet, for decades, she has continued to carry out some of the most demanding duties within the royal family. That is why, when King Charles requested changes to the Counsellors of State system in 2022, adding Anne and Prince Edward was not a completely new experiment. Both had already served as Counsellors of State before. Princess Anne served in that role from 1971 to 2003. Hansard.parliament.uk Counsellors of State. Bill %2 8 HL %2 9 question mark UTM_source equals chatgpt.com. So King Charles was not simply choosing trusted people. He was bringing experienced royals back into a constitutional system they already understood. And that is important when we look at what actually happened in 2022. King Charles sent a message to Parliament requesting that Princess Anne and Prince Edward be added to the group of Counsellors of State so they could act on his behalf when he was absent from the United Kingdom. commonslibrary.parliament.uk https://commonslibrary.parliament.uk/creating-more-counsellors-of-state/UTM_source equals chatgpt.com. Parliament then changed the existing Regency Acts to add them to the pool of Counsellors of State. commonslibrary.parliament.uk https://commonslibrary.parliament.uk/research-briefings/cb p-9675/UTM_source equals chatgpt.com. So, when headlines today describe Princess Anne as a new regent, there is an important distinction to remember. Princess Anne is not a regent. Her official constitutional role is Counsellor of State, and that is the real story. The royal family's official website confirms that the 2022 changes allowed the Princess Royal and the Duke of Edinburgh to serve as Counsellors of State. royal.uk https://www.royal.uk/counsellors-of State UTM underscore source equals chatgpt.com. But that does not make her role unimportant. When necessary, Counsellors of State can be authorized to carry out certain important constitutional functions on behalf of the monarch. These can include attending Privy Council meetings, accepting diplomatic credentials, and, in certain circumstances, granting royal assent to legislation. commonslibrary.parliament.uk https://commons-library.parliament.uk/creating-more-counsellors-of-state/UTM underscore source equals chatgpt.com. And this is the part that many people may overlook. The monarchy is not only about ceremonies, public appearances, and royal events. Behind all of that is a constitutional system. And if the monarch becomes temporarily unavailable, that system needs a way to continue functioning. Princess Anne is now part of that system. But her real strength does not come only from the law. It comes from trust. For decades, Princess Anne has built a reputation for simply doing the work. She has been involved with more than 300 charities, organizations, and military regiments in the UK and overseas, while devoting a large part of her working life to official engagements and visits. Royal.uk https://www.royal.uk/the-princess-royal UTM underscore source equals chatgpt.com. Her public image has also been very different from that of some other members of the royal family. She is often associated with duty, consistency, and hard work. And that makes her especially valuable when the monarchy needs stability rather than drama. Because constitutional authority can be created by law, but trust cannot be created by law. Trust has to be earned. And Princess Anne has spent decades earning it. That is also why her future role could become important for the next generation of the monarchy. Prince William is the future king. Princess Anne is not replacing him. She is not changing the line of succession. Instead, her role is to support the crown within the constitutional system when she is required to do so. William represents the future of the monarchy. Anne represents a huge amount of institutional experience in the present, and that combination could become important as the royal family continues to change. But one point must remain clear. If King Charles were ever unable to carry out his constitutional duties for a longer period, the Counsellors of State system would not automatically turn into a formal regency. Regency is a separate constitutional process. The parliamentary briefing on the 2022 legislation specifically explained that the changes allowed Anne and Edward to act as Counsellors of State when the sovereign was ill or absent, but not in circumstances where a regency was required. lordslibrary.parliament.uk https://lordslibrary.parliament.uk/research-briefings/LLN-2022/0054/UTM underscore source equals chatgpt.com. So, Princess Anne should not be described as a replacement for the king. She is not taking the throne, and she is not replacing Prince William. She is part of a constitutional system designed to help certain royal functions continue when the monarch is temporarily unavailable. And perhaps that is the most interesting part of the entire story. The change made in 2022 may have looked like technical parliamentary business at the time, but it created an important part of the monarchy's constitutional support structure. King Charles did not suddenly give Princess Anne the throne. He did not officially make her a Princess Royal Regent. Instead, he strengthened an existing constitutional mechanism and made sure that experienced senior royals such as Anne and Edward were part of it. And Princess Anne? She continues to do what she has done for decades. Duty, consistency, service. Perhaps that is why her importance cannot be measured simply by her title. She has never needed to fight for the throne. She has never needed to make herself the center of attention. She has built her position through years of service, and perhaps that is exactly what King Charles values most, because constitutional authority can be given by law, but trust has to be earned. So if the British monarchy faces difficult constitutional circumstances in the future, Princess Anne's role could become extremely important. But it should be understood for what it actually is, not as a new Princess Royal Regent appointment, but as part of the constitutional framework strengthened in 2022. And perhaps the clearest way to describe the entire story is this. King Charles did not suddenly give Princess Anne power. He strengthened a constitutional role within the monarchy, and Princess Anne had already spent decades building the experience and trust needed to serve in it. And if the crown ever needs support in the years ahead, one thing is already clear. Princess Anne's name is already part of the constitutional system.